We are at our 60th lesson on biblical hermeneutics. Actually, in truth, it's the 61st lesson because one of the lessons was so long we divided up into two shorter lessons. But we'll still call it lesson number 60. In our book, it's lesson 60. And we're going to look at the use of exaggeration. There's two kinds of exaggeration that are used in figures of speech. So we have exaggeration to emphasize a point or a doctrine. So sometimes we exaggerate things. There are three types of exaggeration in the scriptures, actually. These are not to be understood as being lies, though. They're not lies, they're just exaggerations for emphasis. There's an overstatement, and the exaggerated statement, according to Webster, an overstatement, and this is my definition, over exaggeration, which could be understood if taken literally, but the meaning would be incorrect. So that's my definition of it. You get the incorrect definition if you take it literally. Hyperbole, so a figure of speech where you express much more or less in the truth. Exaggerated statement. We're going to use it for much more in ours. We're going to limit it to that. So my definition, exaggeration used in hyperbole precludes any literal interpretation of the saying or passage. So the exaggeration can't be taken literally. Okay. Hyperbole is from huper, the Greek preposition, and it sometimes would be translated or pronounced hyper or hooper. The upsilon can be translated as a Y or a U, either one. And then bole, it's just something thrown. I throw, something thrown. So something thrown above, say. Therefore, the hyperbole is that which is thrown above or exaggerated for comparison purposes. So we exaggerate something with hyperbole. We'll see some of these in the New Testament and the scriptures in general. In meiosis, that's a Greek word, is Greek for a lessening of something, treated less than it really is, from metonymy, it's metonymy of less. A rhetorical figure by which a thing is represented as less than it is. This is according to Webster. Arden and Gingrich, this word is in the Greek language. I don't think it's found in the New Testament, however. So it won't be in Thayer, but Arden and Gingrich has the New Testament lexicon plus extra biblical words that are found in writings of the church fathers and others. Okay, so it's a little bigger lexicon, and it's meiosis, a lessening, a diminution. So you make it smaller than it really is. And now, let's look at Jesus' overstatement. And if thy right hand causes thee to stumble, pluck it out, cast it from thee. But it's probably that one of the members should perish and not be the whole body be cast into hell. Thy right hand causes thee to stumble, cut it off. Cast it from thee, for it is probable that one of thy members should perish and not thy whole body go into hell. So what's he saying here? The literal removal of the eye would not in itself prevent lust. One could be blind and still lust. Okay? Since lust comes from the heart, Matthew 15:19, not the eye, the real of the eye will not prevent lust. So this is a figure of speech. We see in Matthew 15:19, for out of the heart come forth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, ratings, and so forth. These come from the heart. And we find then common sense tells us that Jesus is saying to remove whatever causes one to sin, to remove it. That's what he's telling us, not telling us to pluck your eye out, to pull the eyeball out. That's foolish. And do the job anyhow, see. We're not to place ourselves in a situation in which we would be tempted to sin. And we can see this, and I see a good example of this. Joseph and Potiphar's wife back in Genesis. And he fled away from her, got away from her. Of course, she lied about him. And then Potiphar's household had been blessed and with great blessings because he was a good servant in charge of things. And then whenever Joseph was put in prison, I strongly suspect that things went south on Potiphar's household at that time. And probably they weren't blessed anymore. To paraphrase, let's go back, get away from Potiphar's wife. To paraphrase Jesus, he's saying, remove anything that will cause you to sin, even if it's painful to do so. That's what the lesson is. So it would be painful to pluck your eye out. It'd be painful to cut your hand off. So do whatever you have to do to keep from sinning and remove that thing that prevents you or causes you to lust, whatever it is. Back to Matthew 5:37. And you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in the Sermon on the Mount. But I say unto you, resist not him that is evil, but whosoever smiteth thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. If a man would go to law with thee and take away thy coat, let him take away thy cloak also. So right here we get a little bit of overstatement. Now, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Resist not him that is evil. Now we are to resist evil in some sense. So here he's talking about smiting on the cheek. If you look at it, there's two different words. In English, we say slap and hit with the fist. And close your fist and hit someone. So if I close my fist and hit someone, I'm trying to hurt them. If I slap them, it's an insult. And this right here, smiting, is the word for slapping. And so what he's saying is, if you have an insult, just turn the cheek. Don't let the insult cause you to react. Someone insults you, leave it alone. Just drop it. Leave it. Okay? If you go to law, they take away that coat, let him have that cloak also. Here in this passage, you see right here that the man is going to law. He's going to take your coat. Why? Because under the law, you have forfeited by maybe a debt or something of that order, probably a debt here. So you actually owe it. So be willing to give what you have to give to take care of your debts. And of course, that's what we see here. Whosoever would compel to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Don't be willing to go the extra mile. Give him that ask thee, and for him that would borrow thee, turn not that way. Borrowing under the law of Moses was for benevolent purposes. The person was obligated to pay it back, but you couldn't charge interest on the person. So right here now, this is an overstatement. To take this they would give because one would become naked, for the coat and the cloak constitute the entirety of one's clothing. Let's go back to the slides here now. Give him your coat, your cloak also. That's your entirety of your clothing. And you become naked. And since it's wrong to become naked, at least in public, this passage must be a figure of speech. That's why we deem it's figurative language. Jesus is saying that one must be willing to endure insult and injury for the cause of Christ. And so, if that's the case, then we just have to take it. For instance, if we study the book of Hebrews, we see that the early church had a problem because they had their lands and their property taken away from them. The Jewish Christians did in Palestine, what we call Palestine, Judea at that time. So they had their properties taken away from them because they became Christians. Into that situation, if they went to court, they're going to lose because you're an apostate to Judaism, and so we are going to take your land away from you, your house and your land, your job and everything else. You lose your job. under those conditions there, we do what the government will let us do, but we cannot go further. And so we have to lose that case. In this case, they lost their land and properties. There were probably some that just weren't willing to give it up, so they kept giving up being Christians. But the true Christian was willing to give it up. He was willing to sacrifice that, and rather than turn away from the Lord. In Matthew 7, verse 1, again in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus used overstatement, judge not that you be not judged. But what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. Well, what measure you make, you shall be measured unto you. My bill is out the mote that is in thy brother's eye, and consider not the beam that is in thine own. So he's looking at judging someone, and here's a person that has a beam in his eye. This would be a log, something, a large piece of wood. And the mote is just a little speck of sawdust, something to that effect. And you're trying to get it out, but you got a log sticking out of your eyeball. And that would be, it's almost comical when you think about it. Here's a man that's got a log sticking out of his eye, and he's trying to see so he can help his brother get the little speck of dust out of his sawdust out of his eye, or a small piece of wood out of his eye. And again, it's almost comical when we think about it. An example of overstatement, because it would pose a contradiction to John 7:24. Let's go back now, see what he said. Judge not, don't judge. It's been a judge. Now, what's he saying? Don't judge by a wrong standard. How do I know that? Because you're going to be judged by whatever standard you measure to other people. If we judge people by a standard that is not correct, not according to God's law, and we're stricter than God is, God will turn around and judge us by that same standard we apply to others. That's only fair. That's the way I read this. In John 7:24, judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. So they were commanded to judge, and judging by righteous judgment was by the standard of the law of Moses at that time. But they weren't judging by that. They were judging by appearance. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 6, verse 1. We see that saints are to judge in some sense. Yeah, and if you're having a matter against his neighbor, go to law before the righteous and not before the saints. Or know you not that the saints, the expression, know you not that, and I'll put my mouse over it, know you not that, odate, huin, hoti, in Greek, that expression there always introduces an argument. So he says, don't you dare, any of you have a matter against his neighbor, go to law against. The word neighbor is not a good translation here. A different person, it's heteros. And one person of a different nature. For the unrighteous and not before the saints. I know you not that the saints shall judge the world. There is some sense in which the saints will judge the world. Now, I have a problem with this passage in that I can't see us standing in judgment on the judgment day. But we can judge them by our living by the standard of God's will and teaching God's will by what we teach and what we practice. If we live by the standard of God's word, then we have the right to be appealed to. The Lord can appeal to our actions as a standard. And so I think it's the doctrine we teach and the life that we live. That's how I view this. Know you not that the saints shall judge the world, and if the world is judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? He's talking about small matters in this passage. Now, we won't go through this passage in great detail, but you can go to my notes of the YouTube link on the book of 1 Corinthians and find chapter 6, verses 1 through about verse 12, and see all the arguments I make on that passage, and you'll get a better feel for that. But we have the smallest matters whatever this was that they were judging, and they were told to judge, that they were judged was a small matter. No, not that we shall judge angels, and how we judge angels, and that's another question. Again, we don't have passage of scripture other than this that tells us this, so we don't know much more about this, and much more things pertain to this life. So I would see the judging of angels as something that pertains, as different than something that pertains to this life. So we shall judge angels and much more things that pertain to this life. So if you judge angels, then the things of this life, and that's what he's talking about in this context. The judgment is things relating to this life, and they're small matters. We have to put all these together, all these things together, we can kind of figure out what's going on. If then you have to judge things pertaining to this life, and so we will judge things pertaining to this life. Do you set them to judge who are of no account in the church? Do you choose the last person in the church to make a decision on these matters? No, you don't. You choose the best person you can. But most spiritually minded to make a judgment for you to help you be guided. I say this to move you to shame. What? Cannot there be found among you one wise man who shall be able to decide between the various brethren? Right here we have problems with two brethren going to law with one another. Now, we got a problem. Are both of them sinning? Or is only one of them sinning? If so, if it's only one sinning, which one? Which one's not sinning? So that's a question we have to ask. And that's very important that we answer that question before we go much further in this. I'm convinced that the one taking his brother to law in the context was trying to defraud him. And that's what we find here. You'll have to go to my notes on this because I've probably spent a couple of nights on these passages when we translate and study 1 Corinthians. But I would encourage you to do that for more study on this. But brother goes to law with brother, that before unbelievers. Okay. And a faithful child of God to help them solve their problems. Jesus is warned about judging because we will have the same standard applied to us that we apply to others if we judge more strictly than God does. Now, if we judge more leniently than God does, God won't loose it. He won't make a lenient judgment on us. But if we're stricter than God's taught us to be, the scriptures provide limits, whatever limits we bind more tightly than God does, then God will place that binding upon us as well, what we bind upon others. That's what he's saying there. And let's go back to it. And there it is in John 7:24. That's what I'm claiming it says. It's demonstrated in Matthew 7:2-3. Judge not that you be not judged. For, see, the word for is going to explain it. What's what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. What's what measure you make, what standard you measure people by, you'll be measured by it. It shall be measured unto you. And when we hold us out of the moat, that little speck of sawdust or fine speck of a piece of wood, a small piece, that is in thy brother's eye, but considers not the beam is in thy own eye. Again, we see the limitations of this. Your comments? Swallowing a camel is hyperbole. Now, there are two interpretations given on this, but I think they kind of missed the point on one interpretation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe men, anise and cumin, and have left undone the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done, not left the other undone. So I've heard people say, well, you just tithe and mint and anise and cumin when they try to tell them we need to obey the scriptures. This is not saying that they were doing wrong in the tithing of the mint and anise and cumin. If you read carefully, He says these you ought to tithe these things, that's correct, but you ought not have left the other things undone. What other things? Well, the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faith. Should have done both. He's saying that you should have done both of these things, not just somehow have the idea. Well, if we have the attitude right, we were right with God. Attitude being right is the beginning point of serving God. We have to have the right attitude, and then our actions must follow in accordance with God's will. How can we say we have the right attitude when we don't obey God? He goes on and says, "You blind guides, they strain out the gnat and swallow the camel." So right here, straining a gnat. So you have this something that you've put out and some gnats in it, and you run it through a strainer and get the gnats out of it. So you don't drink a gnat. But you wanted to swallow a camel. That's hyperbole. And you'll strain a gnat out, but you'll swallow a camel. Now, what were they doing? Straining the gnat out might be little bitty things that they're worried about. And it's not wrong to be worried about tithing men and man isn't coming. You need to be sure you give a tithe of it. But that's probably the gnat. But swallowing the camel was whenever they left undone the weightier matters, the law of justice, mercy, and faith. See, I think that's the swallowing the camel. Questions or comments? Leaving one stone upon another is probably hyperbole when Jesus is talking about the temple being destroyed and the city being destroyed. The answer said unto them, "See all these things." Now, the word "all" is a hard word. We got to be real careful because we can get off the beaten track on it. So all is limited by the context, always is. So, and see, not all of these things. And he's talking about the things that we're looking at that time. Verily I say unto you, there shall not be one left here, one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So this whole city of the temple itself will be overthrown. That's what he says here. And that's that we find among the Roman army did destroy the city of the temple. John, the Apostle John, used hyperbole in John 21:25. He said, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even though the world itself would not contain the books that should be written. I don't know how many pages we could write if we just transcribed everything Jesus said in 33 years. It'd be a bunch of pages. But he's saying the whole world couldn't contain it. What could be written or should be written. So it should be written if we were trying to write everything that he had done. What happened here is he wrote down what we need to know to go to heaven. That's what he's telling us in that context. If you go on in verses 30 and 31, you'll see that. Peter said to pray without ceasing. Peter, therefore, was kept in the prison, but prayer was made earnestly of the church, of the God for him. So they were praying without ceasing. They were earnestly praying for Peter's safety. And of course, he was delivered. For God is my witness, whom I serve in my spirit in the gospel of his Son. How unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers. And that says, in effect, that I'm praying often. That's all that's saying. And it's not unceasingly praying. Again, that's probably an overstatement. Hyperbole, most likely. 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. Now, the Greek present tense is durative or continuous action, but it can be what's called iterative action, I-T-E-R-A-T-I-V-E, iterative action, where it's repeated at certain intervals. I think the pray without ceasing probably is iterative. Pray often, I give thanks for my meals every day. I give thanks usually uh, for a good night's sleep, for a safe trip if I have a trip. I give thanks when I get a paycheck. I give thanks for my wife on nearly every day. I give thanks and then go on. I give thanks for some of my brethren, and I pray for their safety when some of my brethren are being operated on. But I pray quite often. And that's what he's saying. Pray frequently. That's all he's saying. He's not saying you have prayer on your lips 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And Paul called himself less than the least. How can he be less than the least? Well, that's a figure of speech. Unto me, I'm less than the least of all the saints, of all saints. I'm less than the least of all the saints. Paul considered himself that. Why? Because he had persecuted the church. He goes on and lays it out for us. Was this grace given? Now, the grace that he was given is not grace that brought his salvation in this context. It's his apostleship, is what it is. He considered it a favor that he had this role of being an apostle. And because it was a privilege, he felt a great need to be careful that he did it the way the Lord wanted it done. And so that would place upon him a great burden to be careful that he did it rightly and correctly in a way that would please his Lord, who had chosen him for that role. But he's less than the least of all the saints, and was this great given to preach unto the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. The Gentiles that he preached to were largely Greek-speaking Gentiles, I believe. I think we can show that from other passages. So right here, I'm less than the least, but he wasn't. He had done some bad things, but those things were forgiven. But the Apostle Paul still wished he could go back. That's true repentance. If you wish you could go back and change what you've done in the past, it's sinful. But if you can change it, then do it. If you can't, then just be wishing that you could. But go on about your life and live it the way the Lord wants you to live it. Begin afresh, begin anew, be born again. Paul called himself the least of the apostles. And the least of the apostles who are not suitable. The word meet means suitable. Be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. So that's why he says that. That's why he thought of himself that way. He was clearly, he remembered his past, what he had done, and he wishes he could go back. I think that's what shows his repentance. I wish I could go back and do it, but I can't. I've been involved in killing people, like Stephen, and I wish I could go back and undo it, but I can't. I'm just going to go forward from this point. So we don't look back at our past. We learn from it. We say, well, I wish I hadn't committed any one sin, which I've never sinned one time. But I have, and I just need to go on. Shake it off, would you please, and go forward. Try to live the best I can. I pray frequently, Lord, help me to live better today than I did yesterday. I think that's a good thing to think of. And Paul was grieved over his former sins, persecuting the Lord's church, but he didn't let it hold him back. He went forward, and he worked harder than all the rest of the apostles. Children of Israel used meiosis in Numbers 13:33 when they saw the Nephilim, sons of Anak, who come in the Nephilim, come up the Nephilim. We were in our own side as grasshoppers, and so we were on their side. Now, you understand, these people were giants. There was a whole race of them. I have a sermon that I preach on that. I think I have it in my flood lectures. I can't remember, but I have it in one of my lectures and one of some material somewhere. And we have evidence that probably Goliath was probably a descendant of these people. He was 9'9", 6 cubits in a span. Cubit is from the elbow to the end of the middle finger, about 18 inches, depending on your height. And 6 cubits And the span, the width of the head he'd be about 9'9" tall. Nearly 10 foot tall. That's a big fella. And this is a whole race, these people, and they're afraid of them. And so we saw them, and we're like grasshoppers. In our side we were, and in their side we were too. So they're seeing them. They see them as seeing us as grasshoppers, small things. But another lesson I would encourage you to think about: Caleb is a great man, and he's 81 years old, I think. If you go back and see when he went into the land of Canaan, and Caleb said, "I want the land where the giants are." So he led the army when he was 81 plus years old, and led an army to fight these 10-foot tall fellows. And he fought them, and they beat them, and they conquered them, because Caleb had God with him, and he had great faith in God. So Caleb is one of the great men of the Bible. I have a couple of sermons on Caleb. I think he's a great man. And you can go back and study his life. It's a beautiful thought to see how he lived. Jesus used meiosis in Luke 14:26. Any man cometh unto me and hateth not his own father, and his mother, and his wife, and his children, and brethren, and sisters, yea, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Now, what's he saying? He's saying you're to hate your father. Well, we're to even love our enemies. Certainly we're to love our parents, our father and mother, and wife and children, and so forth. But what's he saying then? We hate them. Well, but he's saying that your love for me is so great that your love for them seems like hatred, by contrast. In other words, I love God above all else, and I won't let my father and mother dissuade me from serving the Lord. I won't let them cause me to veer away, to quit serving the Lord. I love God more than I do them. But this is a figure of speech, meiosis. And he uses hatred to mean love less. That's what he's using here. And of course, it's a very strong figure of speech. People get the point. My love for God is so great. That's what he's saying. It should be so great that the love for my parents and my wife and children and my brothers and sisters is to be like hatred. It would be considered like hatred when you compare the differences in them. Because I want to do everything to please God. And if I have to go against my father and mother, my wife, my children, and my brothers and sisters, I'll go against them. Those are the very closest people on the earth to us, genetically, of course. Love our family less than we love God. That's the point. But he uses hatred to depict that lesser love. God must take first place in our lives. Scriptures employ two types of exaggeration: hyperbole, exaggeration for effect; meiosis, exaggeration by making something smaller than it really is. Are there any questions?